Good evening, good evening, good evening. Thank you for joining me here for our next part and deep diving into APAC and all the umbrella tentacles that influence, impact, or are supported by APAC. As promised, let's get started. Let's get started with the APAC espionage scandal, better known as the Lawrence Franklin espionage scandal. On August 27th, 2004, CBS reported that the FBI was investigating a possible spy in the Department of Defense working for Israel. Per the FBI, the spy was working under the Undersecretary of Defense Policy, Douglas Feith, and the Deputy Secretary of Defense, William Wolfowitz. Later, he was identified as Lawrence Franklin. Franklin was previously an attaché at the U.S. Embassy in Israel. He was one of two mid-level Pentagon officials within the Office of the Secretary of Defense responsible for Iran policy through the office's Northern Gulf Directorate. Now, into him, it was originally reported that it was a year-long investigation. Stick a pin in that. If you've been here through parts 1 and 2, it's going to get deeper. No documents were turned over, and all the information that he disclosed was conveyed verbally. He did provide information regarding classified presidential directives. And if you're not familiar with what a presidential directive is, it's an executive action, a written or oral piece of instruction or declaration issued by the President of the United States. He also revealed other sensitive information regarding United States deliberations on foreign policy with Iran. And this is the information that he turned over to APAC. According to the New York Times, Franklin was one of two United States officials holding meetings with Iranian dissidents, which included Menasher Ghorbanifar. Once again, my apologies for any names or anything that I mispronounce. I'm doing the best that I can, and I mean no disrespect. But let's move forward. Who was key in the Iran-Contra affair. The meetings were Pentagon approved and brokered via Michael Ledeen, a neoconservative with the American Enterprise Institute, and they took place in June of 2003 in Paris. Franklin was previously assigned to a unit handling the Pentagon's Iraq policy. The Pentagon officials throughout all of this contend that he was not in any position to influence policy. Doesn't mean that APAC wasn't. Let's continue. October 30th, 2004, Israeli officials admitted that Franklin met various times with Noor Gilon, who was the head of the political department at the Israeli embassy in Washington. Now, it was not uncommon for this type of activity to occur between two Iran specialists. So if you're wondering, like, why did it take them so long to catch on? Their behavior, their activity was on the norm. Per Newsweek, Gilon was under FBI surveillance, and it was after these two meetings that Franklin became under the radar of the FBI. Also, per Newsweek, an anonymous source said about Franklin, and I quote, "For whatever reason, the guy hates Iran passionately." Stick a pin in that also, because we're going to cycle back to that much later on. This suggests that Franklin's motives were personal and or ideological and not financial whatsoever. During the end of the investigation, Franklin was fired. He was also demoted and stripped of his security clearance. By May 5th, Franklin was arrested and charged with giving away top secret information. It's beginning to sound a lot familiar, isn't it? Now, upon his arrest, conviction, and everything else, it came out that the investigation actually began in 1999. Yeah, I guess the FBI decided they were going to party like it was 1999 in 1999. It suggested that others at AIPAC, the Israeli embassy, and the Defense Department were involved. Now, the question is, was anybody else held accountable? Was Franklin held accountable? Hold on, child. We're going to get to it. Now, Kenneth Pollock, a National Security Council staffer with the Clinton administration, provided information to Stephen J. Rosen and Keith Weissman. Pollock and David Satterfield was a senior State Department official, were named as unindicted co-conspirators. We're getting real familiar with unindicted co-conspirators these days, aren't we? On May 5th, 2005, criminal charges were filed against Franklin through the FBI. The allegations within the complaint are as follows: that on June 26, 2003, at a lunch, Franklin verbalized classified national defense information related to potential attacks on United States forces in Iraq. That Franklin disclosed classified information to, and I quote, a foreign official and members of the media. And that a search of Franklin's home turned up approximately 83 classified documents. We seem to have a real problem with classified documents within the United States, huh? On May 4, 2005, Franklin was arraigned. He pled not guilty through his attorney and was released on a $100,000 bond. On August 4th, he was indicted through a federal grand jury on 5 charges of violating the Espionage Act of 1917. This included 1 count of conspiracy to communicate national defense information to people not entitled to receive it, 3 counts of communicating national defense information to people not entitled to receive it, and 1 count of conspiring to communicate national defense information to an agent of a foreign government. In the spring of 2004, Franklin agreed to forward faux information to various people. In July of 2004, in the patisserie of the Pentagon City Mall, Nordstrom's, he told Weissman the faux intel. And for anyone who doesn't know, that they basically met in a bakery. They met in a bakery. Now, this fake intel included information regarding assassination plots against Israelis, Iraqis, and Kurds. Weissman swiftly told the respective governments. Wonk, wonk, wonk. Take note of that. Take note of that. Now, according to the Washington Post, and I quote, a lawyer with the AIPAC case said administration officials want this case as a precedent so they can have it in their arsenal. And I also quote, this is a weapon that can be turned against the media. Sounds like the precursor to fake news, doesn't it? On September 30th, 2005, according to the Washington Post, Franklin was negotiating an agreement with prosecutors. Now, it was believed at the time that the agreement was for Franklin to plead guilty to at least 1 conspiracy charge and to continue to cooperate. On October 5th, 2005, Franklin pled guilty to 3 counts of conspiracy, he admitted to passing information due to his frustration with Iran, specifically the Iranian government, and it came out that he had asked Rosen to help him get a position at the National Security Council, although he admitted that he was upset with how the National Security Council was handling things with Iran. I'll give you 2 guesses why he wanted to get into the National Security Council. And he also knew that the information that he was passing over could potentially be used against the United States. On January 20th, 2006, Franklin was sentenced to 12 years and 7 months, as well as fined $10,000. He was to remain free pending cooperation with prosecutors in cases against Weissman and Rosen. Let me repeat that because that's going to be real important. He was to remain free pending cooperation with prosecutors concerning cases against Weissman and Rosen. I don't know who else is sentenced to 12 years and 7 months for treason, but then allowed to go home. Now, the sentencing came down via Judge T.S. Eliot III. In August of 2006, Judge Ellis denied the dismissal motion of Rosen and Weissman due to the government still being able to punish and prosecute anyone who gave classified information. Don't get excited. Don't get excited. Don't act like people weren't gonna, protect a certain complexion. Because even right now, as we're watching everything go down, the people within the Jewish community that are super Zionist and not pro-Palestinian freedom have one particular aesthetic. And it's giving very Hitler. It's giving very eugenics. It's giving very revisionist history. But let us continue. Because later on in the same month, during a pretrial ruling, Judge Ellis ruled that prosecutors had to show that the United States interests were being harmed. Per Ellis, sharing secrets with friends of the United States was not in and of itself criminal. See how I'm not going to dismiss it because I don't want people to say that it's impropriety or I'm being prejudicial. But I'm going to make it so hard for them to prove their case that nobody's really going to notice. He also stated that for it to be a crime, per his written opinion, those accused must have sought benefit to another nation and to harm the United States. This set an extremely high bar for prosecutors. They had to prove Weissman and Rosen meant to harm the United States fully, knowingly. June 11, 2007, prosecutors asked Judge Ellis to reduce Franklin's sentence to 8 years due to his cooperation. Now, why would prosecutors who just had a case tanked, a case that not only would have brought down two extremely prominent businessmen, but subsequently AIPAC, now be asking for leniency for somebody else when that somebody else didn't get them the results that they wanted? I know Fonnie Willis would never. His sentence was subsequently reduced to 100 hours of community service and 10 months of imprisonment. The suggested community service, I'll give you 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 to guess. And I quote, speaking to young people about the importance of public officials obeying the law. Mm-hmm. And if you watch parts 1 and 2, you already know what happened to Weissman and Rosen. Nothing. Now, let's go to the Kibbutz massacre. Happened on October 14th, 1953. Ariel Sharon led Israeli occupation forces and carried out the massacre at the West Bank. 77 innocent Palestinians were killed. Approximately half were women and children. This was greenlit by Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion Sharon. The order was to, and I quote, attack and temporarily occupy the village, carry out destruction, and maximize killing in order to drive out the inhabitants of the village from their homes. Doesn't all of this sound familiar? Now, due to international backlash, Ben-Gurion denied that Israeli forces were ever in the village. He called the situation, the massacre, a false and fantastic tale. Sound familiar? We keep trying to tell you all that they use the same playbook over and over again. The verbiage doesn't change. The excuses don't change. The occupation immediately worked to cover up the massacre, but there were plaques that were erected in honor of the martyrs and survivors, and the survivors continue to share the history of this massacre orally. This occurred during the Operation Shoshana, which was a reprisal operation. Reprisal operations, most notably and most often, occurred in the 1950s and the 1960s. They were raids carried out by the IDF. They were in response to armed, basically freedom fighter attacks on Israeli soldiers and citizens. I would say more soldiers than citizens, but the internet is a fickle place when the United States is funding you. Reprisal operations were used as a deterrent as well as Army unit training. Sound familiar? Many that were involved, many of the reprisal operations, their focus was attacking villages and Palestinians in the West Bank. Israel is quite familiar and quite well versed at collective punishment. Now, the West Bank was under the control of Jordan at this time of the massacre. There was a mosque, homes, and a school that were destroyed. Now, there were people who came out and publicly condemned the massacre: the U.S. State Department, the UN Security Council, and global Jewish communities. The State Department reprimanded Israel and reminded them that economic aid was previously suspended for not complying with the 1949 Armistice agreements. So we can pull this. We can pull their card. We've done it before. Ask your representatives, ask your president and vice president why we aren't doing that now. But let's continue. The massacre was in response to the Yehud attack, where an Israeli woman and two of her children were killed. Now, before we go any further, we're talking about reprisal attacks. I gave you the definition of that. So let's look at the Yehud attack. That happened on October 12th, 1953. Look how quickly Israel can move. That doesn't even seem like really enough time to do proper surveillance and get proper intel. But what do I know? Okay. It's not like I'm a 5-star general. So it is stated that Palestinian, basically freedom fighters, infiltrated the village of Yehud. A grenade was thrown into a home, and that's where the individuals were killed. The perpetrators were tracked back to the village of Rantis, which is 5 miles north over Kibya, and the massacre happened. And that 1949 armistice, of course, we're going to talk about it. The 1949 armistice agreements were signed by Israel, Syria, Egypt, Jordan, and Lebanon. It formally ended the hostilities of the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. It demarcated the Green Line. The UN established reporting and supervising sanctions for the agreed upon de facto border. Ceasefire discussions led to the signing of the Tripartite Declaration of 1950. Now, this is where I really want y'all to pay attention. The Tripartite Declaration of 1950 was between France, the United States, and the United Kingdom. Okay, this was a pledge to action outside and within the UN to prevent violations of the frontiers, meaning the borders. It also outlined a commitment to stability and peace in the area. It outlined the US, the UK, and France's opposition to the use and or threat of force. It reinforced opposition to arms development between Israel and Arab countries. Now, per the armistice, Israel would encompass 78% of mandatory Palestine as it stood post the independence of Jordan in 1946. The Arab areas not controlled before 1967 were Jordanian ruled West Bank and Egyptian occupied Gaza Strip. Now, I know that I said that I would go over the Goldstone report with you all, but when I dug up all of my notes, it's a little bit more than anticipated. So tomorrow we're going to get a twofer. I'll give you the Goldstone report and a little more. Thank you for joining me here. And if you're enjoying this deep dive into all things that are connected to AIPAC, I'll see you tomorrow.